Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Being a Fan of Disney, the podcast. And today I'm here with Amy Davis from the University of Hull and Helen Haswell from Queen's University, Belfast. And we are here to talk about Disney research, their Disney fandom. They both invest or they both study different areas of Disney. And also the main kind of, I guess, crux of what brought us together is Alphaville, the outlet, is doing a special issue on 100 years of Disney. And so um, I was fortunate enough to be able to write something for this outlet. Amy and I published in this outlet. And so I'm going to have Dr. Davis and Dr. Haswell talk about their roles in editing the special issue. So toward the end of the interview, of our conversation, we'll get into that. And just a note so everybody knows, once we get into that portion, Dr. Davis and Dr. Haswell will alternate back and forth a little bit, talking about the articles in the special issue. That's because those are the articles they were responsible for editing, and kind of getting from creation of the article through the review process to the publication process for those articles. So thank you both for joining us. This is going to be a lot of fun. And the first thing, um, and on my screen, I see from left to right, I see Amy and then Helen. So we'll just go in that order. So the first question is, what was your origin story for your Disney fandom? So where did it begin? How have you gotten to where you are today? Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Obviously, Disney has always been around, always been in the background of my life. But my first real sort of conscious engagement with it was probably, and in a serious kind of way where I really recognized that there was something big about this, was in when I was 5, and my grandmother took me to Disney World in Florida. Which she was living in Florida and went down to visit her. But it was somehow or another, it was just me, not my parents or my younger brother, just me. So I was absolutely the queen of Disney World for the day, according to my grandmother. And, sort of that first time going to the parks, walking around it, this would have been in the late 70s, and just being overwhelmed with how amazing this place was. I'd been aware of it before that, but to see it, to walk around it, I still, all these years
Hmm.
later, have really vivid memories of it. And my grandmother, during the course of the visit, mentioning that she was born in the same year as Mickey Mouse, which was just like, whoa, this is incredible. And just finding it a fascinating place. And while I've, become primarily associated in my scholarship with the animated feature films, and I do love them, they're kind of my third favorite traditional Disney thing. It's the parks, then the shorts, and then the animated features. Um, and yeah, I've never published on the parks, not entirely by design, but at the same time, I'm good with that because then I can just occasionally go and
Hmm.
visit them and just enjoy them.
Hmm. And when you on your first visit, thanks for that. Do you remember when they introduced or I'm sorry, when they took away the ticket books?
The first time I went, they were still using the
They
ticket
were still
books.
used.
I'm
And
I'm quite old.
also did no, I like I'm fascinated with this era of
Hmm.
when Walt Disney World
Yeah,
opened because
yeah.
um I've also heard, did that grandparents, did they pay to get into the park? Because you had to
Oh
buy a
gosh.
book.
Well, you
And
had to buy
so,
admission, and they gave you, as I recall, and I was, like I
okay.
say, I was five. So I knew what money was, but I wasn't like
Yeah.
totally conscious of these things. But I remember when we paid to get in, we bought our tickets at, the ticket booth at the entrance to the park. They gave us with the admission our first books, and each person had,
Okay.
if you had a ticket, you had a book of these extra the ride tickets. And, they'd be sort of lettered A, B, C, D, and E, depending on the sort of popularity of the ride I guess in some ways the tameness of the
Hmm.
ride. So like the A ticket rides were things like, the horse-drawn trolley on Main Street, stuff like that. All the way up through the E tickets, which were the really, really popular or really exciting rides. So Space Mountain, I think Haunted Mansion was an E ticket, stuff like that. Um, and yeah, and then there were kiosks around the park where if you used up either all of your tickets, which didn't seem to happen often, or you used up the tickets that you wanted to use that were, whatever letter grade that you wanted that ride, you could buy a new book of
Yeah.
tickets. I don't know personally off, and certainly I have no memory of when that finished, but I know a couple of years later when I went back to Disney World, they'd got rid of that. But when you bought your entry ticket, they gave you, it was a big, I mean, to me, I was thinking about seven or so big sort of piece of cardboard types paper. It wasn't even really
Yeah.
laminated or anything like that. And it was on a string, and you had to tie it to your clothes, which right away creates a problem if you don't happen to be a man wearing a
Yeah.
button-down shirt. I had on like a little sort of haltery top type thing, and they had it. I know mine was tied to that. We have some photographs of that, and I can remember it becoming just desperately annoying to have this big
Yeah.
tag hanging on the front of me. And everybody, of course, had these, which A is very irritating and annoying because of the size of it and the fact that it's constantly on you, but B is really stupid to make everybody show that they are able to be there, that they have a ticket when they've already paid to get in, and to tie a piece of paper on the front of someone in a subtropical climate
Yeah.
where, the afternoon rainstorm is inevitable. It's a very rare thing not to
Yeah.
get rained on at Disney World. And I even managed to get rained on at Disneyland, for God's sake. And people, they would get lost, they would get destroyed. I know one of my grandfathers was with us on that trip, and his starts out tied to, I think, a shirt pocket button, and by the end is just kind of shoved in the pocket because he doesn't, it's like I'm
Yeah.
sick of this thing. So yeah,
So
and then that goes away eventually.
was that, I mean, I've never heard of that. Did they keep up with rides on that, or was that just the ticket?
You were just in, and you didn't have to fool, which that was the one good thing about it, was you no longer had to fool with buying extra ticket books to get the rides you wanted.
Yeah, that is a little strange that
Hmm.
you would have proof of your ticket after walking through the gates, which should be proof of your ticket, but I guess
Yeah.
so. Okay, Helen, your introduction to Disney fandom.
So my fandom is with the films for sure. The animated features. Via my grandparents. My nan and granddad were big Disney fans. Anyway, my granddad had all he was a big movie buff, and he had floor to ceiling um bookcases full of videos, VHS tapes, and every Saturday we'd get to choose one, my siblings and I, to watch on the small TV in the back room. But also my nan, when she retired from teaching, she worked in a cinema, and on a Saturday, the five of us would were able to go along with her and help clean up popcorn in between the screenings, and then get to sit in and watch films. So that was really where our introduction came. I would be a fan, I guess, early fan of the Renaissance period. So
Hmm.
films like Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Mulan, The Lion King. Um, that would be my introduction, and through the music as well, and merchandise. Merchandise in the 90s was huge. You
Mhm.
know, any film that came out, we always had any birthday, any Christmas. We had all of the merchandise, courtesy again of my grandparents. So I think they created Disney fans in all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you. I remember of- you're talking about the VHS. I remember having a lot of Disney VHS. Um, I remember, um, and actually, in the paper we wrote about Disney streaming, we get into a little bit about the vault, not very much, and the kind of the cost of bringing home that home entertainment. But I
Yeah.
remember in particular, it was from the first trip, and this is I guess a parks story again, but from the first trip we took to Walt Disney World, my grandmother bought it was like a vacation planning VHS. But I watched that so much, so many times, just would, watch it, rewind. It was like my
Yeah.
mom always would tell a story about Star Wars, how like she would say like, "Oh, we're almost to where we need to be. We're almost in the town. We're almost to someone's house." And I would say like, "Oh, that's just like Luke said when they got to the Dagobah system." Like I was that type of kid that would just rewatch things over and over and over again. So I remember very vividly, and now you can actually watch the video on YouTube. So I remember, watching about the Pirates of the Caribbean ride and the
Yeah.
Haunted Mansion, and the way that they presented the Haunted Mansion was so interesting in that video because it was this scary kind of haunting thing. Um, and growing a lot of like hesitance for kids to go on that ride. Now if you go, like, a lot of times you'll see parents trying to coax their kids onto the ride saying, "Nah, it's not that bad, it's more funny than anything." And so I those early VHSs were also a large part in my fandom. Um, I'm lucky in that I started watching kind of at the end of right before the Renaissance, and then up through the Renaissance. So I remember Fergie from the Black Cauldron, and then jumping into kind of the Renaissance era and seeing those really really fun movies. And um, so yeah, the VHS to me, that home entertainment played a huge role in that. So that's a really really cool story. So then next, talking about research. Um, the question is, how did you get into researching Disney? And then you could go ahead and combine that with what specific areas of Disney that you
Okay.
research, and we'll kind of possibly dovetail off of that. So, Amy, if you
Okay.
want to start again.
Sure. So well, I was doing my master's degree and it was in modern history at University College London. And it was at the point where we were supposed to pick a dissertation topic for our master's. And I couldn't decide. And I kept having, I already had been assigned a supervisor, um, but I hadn't picked a topic. And so I'd meet with him and we'd throw this idea around, that idea around, so forth. And I couldn't come up with anything. And then one night, and it just was a coincidence, before a meeting, I happened to be I had a phone conversation with my brother. And I don't even remember exactly what it was we were talking about, but we were talking about something to do with Disney. And he's always been a very keen Disney fan as well. In fact, at one point, until he did a year of art college, he wanted to be a Disney animator. But he found after a year of an animation and illustration program that while he still loved all the films and all, he did not want to be an
Mhm.
animator. Um, and so I kind of had Disney extra sort of swirling in my brain when I went into this latest meeting. And I very flippantly, because I was getting a little sort of fed up with this process, I very flippantly said to him, to my supervisor, his name was Melvin Stokes, uh, why don't I just do it on Disney? And he kind of looked at me, he's like, well, why not? And there was this sort of, you, you mean I can do this?
Hmm.
You mean that's okay? And he's like, yeah, sure. I mean, obviously you have to narrow it down from Disney, but yeah. And at that time, nobody really was doing Disney. I was actually the first person to do a film history master's and PhD. In particular, the first to do a PhD in film history at UCL. And so I sort of brainstormed again very quickly some ideas and settled on representations of femininity in human female characters. And so I did a spread across of just three films for the Masters, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because that was the first. Um, at that time, Pocahontas, because that was the most recent.
Hmm.
And then in the middle, I went with Sleeping Beauty.
Okay.
And because she sort of fell halfway between, and then transitioned right into a PhD on that, but obviously bringing in all of the human female characters. Um, and honestly, just kind of never stopped, never
Yeah.
looked back from there. And of course, the PhD thesis was later, a few years after I finished my PhD, got turned into the book Good Girls and Wicked Witches, which was published in 2006. And yeah, the rest is history.
Thank you. Helen, go ahead.
A similar story, I guess. I was studying film studies, Queen's University in Belfast, and we had been asked to pick our dissertation topics and didn't know that you could do research on Disney, Pixar. For me, it was Pixar. But I had done an animation studies module in my second year, which I absolutely loved, focused mainly on anime and Japanese animation. So to find out that we could study popular cinema and the mainstream, I kind of jumped at the chance to do my undergrad dissertation on Pixar and storytelling and narrative, and continued on with my MA dissertation, where I looked at the representation of women in mainly Pixar, but also looked at Disney then. And that developed into my PhD topic, which again was focusing on Pixar animation, the development of the studio, its role in the development of digital animation primarily. But of course, you can't really talk about Pixar without talking about Disney, and it very quickly developed into the relationship between the two studios and the two companies, and looking at the impact of the 2006 acquisition of Pixar, and seeing how that had impacted both of the companies. So that was my into more of an industrial approach, focusing really on the relationship between Disney and Pixar.
Okay. And thank you for that. So on the acquisition of Disney and Pixar, because that's something that um, I became interested in when I first started teaching this class and first started kind of realizing there's a world outside of what I was researching that I could kind of expand my research into those areas. Um, what was at that time, what was kind of the public perception of the acquisition? I don't really remember. I mean, I remember I've told my kids that seeing Toy Story for the first time, specifically Toy Story and a non-Disney movie, Jurassic Park, I said those two movies, when I saw those, I thought this does change things. And I think 11 or 12 when um, those movies would have come out. But I was like, this is completely different than anything we've seen. Like these are real looking dinosaurs as much as we can
Mm.
think something that's extinct looks. Um, and this, like this animated feature is completely different looking than anything else. So I didn't realize, and I learning more after that, I know that they were just, Toy Story was presented as Toy or Disney Presents, a Pixar animation production. I didn't realize that 2006 Cars was really the first movie released under Disney Pixar banner. Um, so what was kind of the public perception of that purchase when it was going on?
So, well, you're absolutely right. The Toy Story is the catalyst really for change within the animation industry. So it's the first full-length, completely computer animated feature film, and it is often, and it was intentionally misbranded as a Disney film. So not even um Pixar Presents, but the success of Toy Story allowed Pixar to go in and renegotiate a lot of the um contract terms that they had had with Disney, and part of that was the size of the logo, and how
Mm,
Pixar's name would appear. Um, so in a lot of the I guess the critical reception of Toy Story, it's constantly referred to as a Disney film. So what we see prior to the acquisition is very much a story of Pixar becoming more popular, outdoing Disney. This is a time as well when we're past the Renaissance for Disney animation. They start to experiment a bit, and it doesn't work out very well for them. And in the meantime, Pixar's popularity is growing. So by the time we get to 2006, actually Disney animation is struggling a bit. So the acquisition is seen as a way of Disney buying some of that
mhm,
popularity and this a different way of doing animation. Um, and then after the acquisition, we start to see Disney animation, this rejuvenation of the animation department. Um, I guess reaching the pinnacle, the peak of success with Frozen, which when it was released, $1.2 billion
mhm.
at the box office, was the highest grossing animated film of all time. And then
And
we
what,
start to
four
see a
times that?
decline.
Sorry, I was going to say, and what, four times that much in merchandising?
Yeah. And still,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially after the release of the sequel, 2019.
Mhm.
So we see this shift for sure. 2006 marks a shift between the two companies, and we start to see also what's it's interesting you talk about the public perception, because that's exactly what it is, this creative decline at Pixar. Their films don't perform as well as they did prior to 2006. We see more sequels. We see these like heightened merchandise coming out. As you mentioned Cars, the Toy Story series, um, lots of sequels, as I've said. So very much that's the shift in public perception between the two studios.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, more recently, Pixar has been um experiencing kind of a downturn. A lot of that, I think, is the questionable marketing and decision making when streaming was everything and really the main focus or the main metric for success was subscribers, and let's just get more subscribers. And I remember having a conversation with someone in summer 2020 and asking, you know, what's the metric of success now is subscribers. Um, and I didn't really push back much on this, or we didn't really talk too much about this, but I remember thinking there are there are really, really smart people working for these studios. Do they not see that this is not the like sustainable? And you know, what I think the first quarter of 2022 rolls around and Netflix has kind of a bad quarter. They lost subscribers, and then all of a sudden everything's flipped on its head, and it's like now we have to be more profitable. And I refuse to believe that I was one of the few people who was thinking like this growth in subscribers and that being the main metric of success. I refuse to think like I was one of the only people thinking that that wasn't going to work. Like there had to be people in the background thinking this isn't sustainable. We have to make this more profitable. However, this is what the stock market is looking for now. So therefore, this is what the shareholders are looking for now. This is what the entertainment industry is saying is successful. So we just kind of roll with it until the reactionary like nature of the entertainment industry and stocks and everything changes and then we play catch up. But you know, during that time when it was so important to put everything on Disney Plus possible, I mean, you had three movies that went straight to Disney Plus. You took a brand in Pixar that was so successful and, as you said, was purchased in 2006 because or 2005 and first movie released in 2006. It was purchased because Disney Studios, Animation Studios was in a lull. Um, and so you take that brand and you put these three great movies directly on the service where like when I talk to people now and I talk to people in the class, and some of it has to do with the age that they were when the movies came out, but a lot of students and people I've talked to, they haven't seen Luca, they haven't seen Soul, they haven't seen Turning Red, because there was not kind of the marketing around this. And so it is very, very interesting to see kind of what Pixar has gone through. Um, and so what are your comments on that?
Well, I think it worked in the short term because, of
Yeah.
course, we were all in a global pandemic in lockdown. So, I mean, I remember when Soul was being released on Disney Plus that Christmas, it was really exciting to be able to see the new Pixar film because we couldn't go to the cinema.
Hmm.
So it worked in that respect, but there's been a lot of discussion about it um afterwards, like in more recent year or two, um, and how it reflects how Disney sees Pixar now. Because the films, of course, are not behind a paywall for any of the other like
Hmm.
Disney animated films, Raya and the Last Dragon, and the remake of Mulan. I remember specifically, you had to pay extra on top
Hmm.
of your subscription. But they never did that with any Pixar films. So they were just there on the service, perhaps as to try and entice more subscribers. Um, but then when we started opening the world up again, they were still putting Pixar films
Hmm.
straight to Disney Plus. So it said a lot about really how Disney perceived Pixar at that time. And again, that change in going from needing them to improve their own animation studio, and their success to kind of just putting them on it says a lot. It has the same connotations as the direct to video
Yeah.
releases, and that hierarchy for sure.
And
Yeah. Now,
it
was it?
did, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to ask because I'm trying to remember. Was in because Encanto is not Pixar. Encanto is Disney.
Correct.
Mhm.
It didn't. It wasn't sort of paid to get advance in advance, was it? It was direct to the streaming service, wasn't it? Or am
It
I wrong?
it was actually it was in the theaters, at least in the United States. We did see Encanto in theaters.
Okay.
Um,
I can't remember whether we did or not, or it was
I
very
think that it
limited.
was, yeah, I think we did have. But I mean, they have also, Disney have backtracked a little bit and have had special screenings, summer
yeah,
screenings of
yeah.
Luca,
Soul and
Soul,
Canto.
yeah,
And you
Turning
never,
Red.
my interest in the company, I guess I should probably for the purpose of this conversation, people who've listened to the podcast have probably heard me talk about it many, many times before. But for the purpose of this, real quickly, my research evolved where um my PhD is actually in sport administration. And I started looking at how fandom influences the way we feel toward in-group members and out-group members. So within sport, that was your favorite team and your like favorite team's most kind of important rival team. And evolving from there and looking at how people felt, how people behaved toward their rival fans and teams and how they reacted to like rival losses and things and kind of evolving into realizing and studying that, a lot of the messaging from 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 administrators, marketers, promoters, that has a lot to do with the way we feel toward outgroup members. For instance, we did a study on um, if the word hate was used in a rivalry title as compared to the word rivalry, when the word hate was used, it didn't really increase feelings of rivalry per se. It just made people more um, kind of suspicious of the outgroup. And so it's kind of adding to this just kind of overall animosity and negativity. And so from there, we started looking at, okay, if this is happening here, I know it's happening in other areas. And specifically, like one of the first things I thought of was, well, you think it's bad in sport, look in politics and look in religion and things like that.
Mm.
Where we first started, because of my fandom of Disney, is looking at Disney parks and specific to fans of Disney parks, how they felt about the Disney parks and Universal parks. And then from there, we kept going. Now we have 12 different comparisons or 12 different settings that we have studied how people feel toward their favorite brand and kind of that competing brand now. And we've been able to develop a hierarchy to show which brands elicit or influence the most negativity. So, for instance, religion, politics, online gaming, and sport. Actually, I'm sorry, religion, online gaming, politics, then sport elicit the most negativity. Whereas on the lower end of the spectrum is Disney parks, science fiction, comics. And so what's been really, really interesting to me about Disney, one is they have been involved in sport, um, which is one of the negative, elicits or influences negative behavior. But most other things they've been involved in are kind of on that lower end of the spectrum. And so, could Disney represent kind of this brand because it's 100 years old, because it's seen as kind of a family brand? Um, could it represent this catalyst to bring people like a shared perspective? And so maybe somebody who disagrees uh, in their political ideology, um, but they both are fans of Disney in one way or another. Like, is that common interest that at least can start kind of not even possibly a conversation about those difficult topics, but allowing people to kind of live together, coexist together in this society that we have. Um, and so because of all of that, my interest has really been in the fandom and also the business or strategic decision making process of Disney. And so I've become really, really interested in looking at kind of how Disney competes with other studios, how they're competing with, if they are competing with the streamings, I mean the tech companies now, and things like that. So these conversations about like the acquisition of Pixar is really, really interesting to me. The acquisition of Lucasfilm, of Marvel, and kind of the inner workings of all of those have been really, really interesting. So again, that was try to be a brief explanation of where I'm coming from and my interest in all of this. And it does lead to the next question of both of you have looked at the representation of femininity or representation of women in Disney animation and or Pixar. Um, how has how has the representation of femininity and of women changed in your view? Um, kind of how does that track with where we as a society have gone and are going in the future, if that makes sense?
Um, I mean, I guess I can start. I mean, on the one hand, obviously, how Disney has represented femininity, particularly in humans, has changed over time in the sense of the individual portrayals and representations. At the same time, one could argue that ultimately what Disney has always done is reflect back via its films that particular period's ideas about women, what is acceptable or unacceptable in women, so forth and so on, what one sort of requires in stories where women are the central characters, remembering that the number of stories, particularly in Hollywood cinema, really any cinema, where women are the central characters are always outnumbered by the ones where men are the central characters. Um, that it has, because it has always reflected back that particular era's ideas and ideals, it has always kind of done the same thing, even if the individual representations have changed. I hope that makes sense.
Hmm.
So for instance, nowadays you'll get sometimes people, and I'm sure Helen does too, get a lot of this kind of thing where they think they're going to be extra smart or cute and tell you something you've never heard before, even though you've heard it 5 billion times about, Snow White is so, it's so old fashioned. It's like, well, of course it's old fashioned. It's
Yeah.
over 80 years old. And I think, if you were to compare it to another film released it was released in December, 21st of December, 1937. It premiered, it went into general release in early January of 1938. If you were to compare it to another film of that period, they're going to look very different from one another. They're going to sound very different. They're going to feel very different because I think if you look at, say, a live action comparison, instantly its antiquity stands out. It's
Hmm.
usually black and white. The way the characters are, dressed, the way their hair is done, the makeup, is very different from what we would be used to now. Even the way people spoke was slightly different, and their accents and so forth. So I think we we notice right away that is an old film. Animation, I mean, certainly those of us who study it can instantly look at most films and go, oh yeah, that film is from this particular decade or period or studio even. But not necessarily, that's not necessarily going to be something that everyone watching a film will notice, an animated film. So maybe they don't think about the fact that something like Snow White is over 80 years old and therefore is going to represent women in a vastly different way than, say, Moana or Frozen or
Hmm.
Tangled or Princess and the Frog or some of these, from the last sort of 10, 15 years, 20 years. They are just going to be very different representations.
Hmm.
Um, I do think that in some ways, when you look at the more recent ones, occasionally Disney is kind of pushing the envelope a bit. And I particularly think that around Elsa from Frozen, primarily in the sense that they have yet to partner her up with
Hmm.
anyone. I know there was a real sort of push for a while there to make Elsa a lesbian. And, if they want to do that ultimately, fine. But I think it's far more progressive to not insist that she have a romantic narrative at all, because that is something that female characters have to sort of get shoehorned in again and again and again. Even in, even if it's based on a true story, they will shoehorn in romantic representation or romantic storylines, for instance. I always think of, for instance, Hidden Figures, where we get as a subplot of the
Hmm.
film the growing romance between oh God, I've suddenly drawn a blank on their names. But the Catherine
Hmm.
Johnson, Catherine Johnson, and her husband. And this is, they meet, they marry, the whole thing in the film. In real life, they were actually already married before the time
Hmm.
period when the story of Hidden Figures starts. They literally restructured the actual life history of these two characters, of these two people, to give that romantic subplot, because God forbid you have a film about a female
Hmm.
character or even a group of female characters and not give one of them a romantic subplot you know so to do that, with not just a Disney princess but a Disney queen,
Hmm.
only the second Disney queen, um Kida, of course, being the first Disney princess to become a queen in her own right. um that's radical,
Yeah.
and it really is bugging the everlasting hell out of a lot of people.
I did not know that about that. I've watched that movie several times. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
You always know that there are some historical inaccuracies.
Yeah.
Um, that's very, very interesting that happens, and yeah, that it happened in a live action like portrayal of real events, you know.
Hmm.
Um, Helen, what are your comments specifically to Pixar?
Um, well, I was going to, I mean, Amy, you've brought up some really interesting points, and of course, I used your your seminal work
Thank you.
as the foundations for my own readings of Pixar, in particular for my when I was doing my MA. Um, but I guess I just wanted to pick up on a few things, or expand on and echo some of the things that you said, where it's not just um, representation that's changed, and reflecting society, but I think also how storytelling has developed.
Mhm.
We've moved from these stories being influenced by their literary contexts that needed to be very characters that were two-dimensional, that we needed to know who was good and who was bad. We needed to know who to root for. So we've even seen how storytelling and narrative has developed, and filmmaking. But what's useful with Disney as a using them as an example is because we have got such a huge 100 years essentially, or 80 years if we're talking about the feature films, of content that we could actually go back. It's a useful scholarly exercise to go back and look at characters from specific periods and see how they have changed and developed, bringing us up to the contemporary, um, and seeing how they are a lot more progressive, I think. In relation to Pixar, I think what's quite illuminating for Pixar is that they've always promoted themselves, and we've had this public perception of them as being very progressive, and um, particularly with their male characters, they're not these I guess bravado characters. We see them as very sentimental, in touch with their emotions. But it took 13 feature films for them to have a female protagonist. So Brave was released in 2013, and of course, their female character exists within a fairy tale setting. So what is Pixar saying about women and their value from a company that produces very strong female characters? They're always secondary to their
Mhm.
male counterparts. And then, of course, with Brave, released in 2013, our female character is a princess in a genre that Pixar hadn't yet engaged with.
Mhm.
When was Incredibles 2 released? Was that 2014?
I think 2019,
2019?
I
I'll look
think.
it up here real quick.
I know it was 10 years, or it was at least 10 years after
2018.
2018. Um, that, you know, like because Incredibles 2, um, I, her name is Helen, isn't it? The mother?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Um, she, you know, she is the main focus of that one. And so do you think that do you think that's like kind of like a progress or a good lesson learned from like 2014? It was, you know, in this setting, to 2018 it was, or 2013 from the setting of Brave to 2018, where it's this more kind of out in front, and it's not just because also with The Incredibles, I mean, it's an ensemble cast. Obviously, it's a family of five. So each family member has kind of their own storyline and their own things. But especially, and in that first movie, the dad was Bob, I think, was kind of, you know, his story was sort of at the forefront, and him like having trouble to let go of his superhero days. And then in the second one, she was more at the front. And then his story was somewhat secondary about being jealous of her being at the front. What are your impressions of that movie coming from like the 2013 Brave to 2018 Incredibles 2?
I think that there were still issues with it around I think reducing her role again to mother carer. Um, she is more at the forefront of Incredibles 2, and as you say, there's elements where her husband becomes jealous of her new ventures, fame. I think there has been an attempt to address the representation of women, or that there are women at all, you know, as the focus in their films. But I think a lot of that also comes from changes within the structure at these
Hmm.
studios, you know, behind the scenes. We talk about representation, but actually we need to start from who are the people telling these stories.
Hmm.
You know, that's what's important and significant, which is why we see, I guess, leading up to Brave, why it is primarily stories about, I
Hmm.
want to say white men because, or boys, because those are the people that are telling the stories from the studio. Um, so as we start to see that shift, I think, and that those changes being implemented at the narrative level, at the filmmaking level, then we start to see that reflected in the screen.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but in Brave, wasn't that it started with the first female director, but then she did not finish the film, right?
Yeah,
She was replaced, right?
Brenda Chapman. So
Yeah.
this was a big story as well because it's based on her relationship with her daughter. Um, so it's her story. They brought in Mark Andrews as a co-director, and um, as is what we're always told anecdotally, you know, creative differences. And Brenda
Hmm.
Chapman left the project, so left her own project, her own film. So there's even that contention again behind the scenes
Yeah.
that I think, you know, is reflected in the actual story of the film and how it developed.
Yeah, and it's
And
worth
it,
remembering that when, in the lead up to, I don't know if I'd be so bold as to call Helen the main character of Incredibles 2, though she's obviously more important. But that still, that comes out, a good few months, maybe a year before or after John Lasseter
mhm.
is effectively pushed out as part of the Me Too movement, which speaks volumes to what a boys' club Pixar
Mhm.
was
Well, and
and still is.
that was something that I was thinking about when you said it was 2018, that yes, it's under a new um kind of leadership. It's also, you know, it typically what's the lag time for, I mean, you know, I
About
still
4 years.
see what's the lag time between, you know, John Lasseter left and then a few months later is when the movie came out. So he obviously still had a lot of like kind of influence over that. But the but I'm glad you brought that up because that is there was this massive shift within that company, and I feel like you can see that in the different types of stories that are being told as well. And again, I really really wish um, we never heard the numbers on how much the special screenings of Luca, Soul, and Turning Red made, which to me, looking at the business aspect of it, probably means the numbers were not that good because they or not good enough that they wanted to report because that's typically, if something's great, they will report it. I mean, look at what's happening with Inside Out 2 now. Um,
Mhm.
that is like every 2 or 3 days we're getting more reports over, this is the highest grossing movie of 2024 so far. It's going to be over $1 billion. It's, it has a chance to be the highest grossing animated movie ever. Um, and so I just really wish that those stories, Soul, Luca, and Turning Red, were such good stories that I wish it would have been marketed differently. I wish like Soul was somewhat understandable because it was still during like a lot of the world was still locked down at that point. That was the end of 2020. By the time 2021, summer 2021 came along and Luca came along, definitely by the time um, Turning Red came along, it was very strange decisions, especially with Turning Red, that was not a theatrical release and ultimately led to, everybody being totally surprised that Lightyear didn't perform the way they wanted to. Well, you've trained your viewers to just wait for it now. But those three films, and we'll wrap up real quick because we need to get onto the special issue. Um, those three films, what are your impressions of those three films as far as kind of the performance of the storytelling aspect of them, the performance of them, and then how they were marketed? And that's
Well,
that's to both of you.
I think that the marketing for like the cinema release, these summer releases, it hasn't. I think it's kind of gone under the radar a lot. Um, but I also think it's a shame, particularly for Luca and Turning Red, that there wasn't more of a push because
Hmm.
they are by two directors that have come through Pixar and through their short film um um
Division.
yeah. So Enrico Casarosa, who directed La Luna,
Hmm.
and Domi Shi, who directed Bao. So they're homegrown talent essentially, and the the purpose of the shorts program was to nurture and develop in-house talent. So to have two directors who have created very personal stories and have gone through that process and created feature films again based on their own personal experiences, it's it's they're the two films that are what we think of when we think of Pixar,
Hmm.
particularly prior to the acquisition. These original stories that are focused on character and narrative, they're not the first things that you would think of with relation to merchandise. They don't automatically translate in the way that Toy Story or Cars do. So it's a shame that they haven't been made more of a fuss about, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're such beautiful stories and such beautiful films, all three of them, touching on not just important sort of universal aspects of, of the things that our passions with Soul, the things we feel that we were put on this earth to do, or, who we are as individuals and how we understand our identities, or, you know, our relationships with our families, with our parents, that kind of thing. but they ask a lot of incredibly deep personal questions, that I mean, maybe that's part of the problem. For all that there are important universal things within them, they may not necessarily speak to everybody
Hmm.
in terms of these are so much about, I don't know, I think I'm putting it badly. It's they're asking questions about who am I, and asking each of us to sort of think about who am I, in my heart of hearts. And popular cinema can do that beautifully. I think these films have done it beautifully. Marketing doesn't always know how to put that across in a
Hmm.
way that captures that audience. And yeah, I mean, I think Soul in some ways was the most, in some ways, it was the better marketed or the best marketed of the three, I would argue, because even though it is just put on the streaming service and, there's no way to make a profit off of a film in that way, um, it's presented as, these times are terrible. Here's a Christmas
Yeah.
gift from us to you, our Disney Plus family, and it is intentionally sort of put out in, that's at least the
Hmm.
sort of party line. It's put out for free if you have a Disney Plus subscription
Yeah.
on the service, no paywall to get access early or anything like that, timed to be at Christmas time, which, and it was a very, certainly I found it a very challenging Christmas. A lot of people did. Certainly in the UK, at the very last minute, we were told, even people who had family nearby, you could have like Christmas Day with them,
Yeah.
but you really should think twice about it. Um, some of us, I spent Christmas entirely alone. And it was like, oh, here's this nice little
Yeah.
window. Luca and Turning Red, they didn't benefit from that. They were just suddenly on the streaming
Yeah.
service. I do know, I won't go into it too much because I always agree not to do this, but I've somehow ended up in a Disney survey, online sort of periodic consumer survey for Disney Plus. And it is something that comes up in lots and lots of the surveys about how soon do you expect films to appear on the service? How often do you go to
Mm.
the cinema? I do know even before the pandemic, average weekly cinema attendance was so rock bottom that you couldn't
Hmm.
necessarily even think about it as a weekly thing the way it had traditionally been. You go back to say 1929, 1930, and over 90 million people in North America, or at least in the US, were going to the movies on average every week, once a
Yeah.
week. By the time you get to sort of 2017, 18, 19, they were looking at the whole of North America for those same figures. And there were people who were not going to the movies at all in a
Hmm.
given year, or maybe going once to the cinema in a year. So, on the one hand, these films kind of meet the audience where they are at
Yeah.
home watching movies. On the other hand, they never get a chance to really get that run. There's not a big merchandising campaign for them. And, I think of them turning red probably lends itself most to merchandising because of the panda character
Hmm.
would turn into a stuffed animal, a plushie, very nicely, whereas the others less so. But yeah, it isn't given, they're none of them are given the sort of usual pre-release merchandising marketing, the big push. We don't get trailers, we don't get sort of behind the scenes making of, we don't get that marketing push.
Yeah. Well, and I
And that's
do,
where it goes.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, no.
I do remember, like, that's one aspect of that I don't want people to, 5 years from now, for all of us just to forget that any of this ever happened. That, the companies do things for it affects your bottom line, the decisions you make. But you mentioned Soul and the way that it was released. Yes, that makes sense. And that was kind of that was a nice way to get people into the service. it reminds me of Hamilton when Hamilton was released over the
Mhm.
July 4th weekend in the United States. Now, also that
And here.
coincided with it was okay.
Yeah.
That also coincided with that is the week Disney Plus got rid of its free 7-day trial. So at least if somebody was only wanting to watch Hamilton, they had to pay at that time in the United States it was $6.99. So at least they had to do that. Um, but it is everything there are business decisions that or there are business decisions that drive what happens. But also, there were those moments during the early days of the lockdowns or the pandemic that that the company did take strides to at least give the impression they're on their side. And as you said, meeting the audience where they are, which is ultimately why a lot of studios went into the streaming service in general. And it is very interesting that now people look at streaming as, well, is it really that good? Do we are, how much does streaming make these companies? Um, and ultimately, I do think, we'll be left with three or four streaming services. Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime Video, I think are here to stay. Some others I think are going to be combined with companies or services. But it is that process of going where your customers are. The really interesting thing with Luca and Turning Red was that they were not behind a paywall. It felt as though they should be behind a paywall. Soul made sense because it was Christmas Day. It was tough times. Um, and I don't think Mulan did as well as they thought it was going to do behind the paywall. So that had something to do with it. But by the time Luca and Turning Red came along and they weren't behind a paywall, I remember thinking this is very strange and kind of you're taking this brand in Pixar that was so huge and now here it is. So this is what happens when I get on a topic that's interesting. I talk and talk and talk. We have about 10 minutes until Dr. Haswell has to leave for another meeting. So finally, and I guess quickly, um, the Alphaville special issue on 100 Years of Disney. Because of time constraints, Dr. Haswell, do you want to discuss the four articles that you were responsible for kind of nurturing and editing first, and then we'll continue the conversation after that?
I'm happy to do it the way that we had before. I can spend a
Okay.
few more minutes. That's okay.
Okay. Then go ahead. You two had planned out the way that you were going to present it. I think that starts with Dr. Davis.
Yeah. And yeah, we've sort of we're talking about these more or less as far as we know, the running order that will be there for the finished published journal, which we this is our suggested running order anyway. And the first of the articles is by Gabrielle Stecker, and it's called Examining the Legacy of Disney artist Mary Blair. And of course, most Disney fans, they will absolutely recognize the name Mary Blair. They probably, would be familiar with her very beautiful, distinctive art style, which is so wonderfully sort of mid-century in that it is somehow both sort of spare and really lush and beautiful. She had an incredible gift for color and so forth. And she does a lot of work at Disney over the course of her career. And this is one of the things that Stecker's article talks about is sort of how Mary Blair comes to work at Disney and why, because she was going to be a fine artist. She was not going to work in commercial art, and she gets sort of more or less sort of ends up working at Disney, partly because her husband, Lee Blair, starts working at Disney, but she very quickly surpasses him in terms of her input into Disney's art and style and artwork, even though animators, as much as they adored her inspiration art, really struggled to capture it in the final films, in the finished films. Um, the contributions that she made over the years to Disney merchandising, particularly illustrated storybook versions of some of their films, to Imagineering. She designed, for instance, the original facade for It's a Small World at Disneyland in California, and did a lot on Small World, actually. She designed and put together the mosaic in the Grand Canyon Concourse in the Contemporary Hotel at Walt Disney World. Her fingerprints are all over Disney. And of course, posthumously, I think it was in 2009, she was made a Disney legend, which is, one of the highest honors
Hmm.
Disney can bestow on current or former employees. And for a lot of people, when they're asked to think about, who are the women who worked at Disney, who are the women who contributed to Disney's history, it's Mary Blair that they
Hmm.
come to first and foremost. Stecker looks at that. She looks at how Blair's legacy has been sort of understood to include where she's been kind of often in very sexist ways dismissed or, sort of undermined as a woman by those who have written accounts of her later on. And also looks at, ultimately, why is it that for a lot of people, they only could name Mary Blair. They wouldn't be able to name other women who worked at Disney, even though there were other women working at Disney pretty much from the beginning. And for instance, there's Hazel Sewell, who is the first person to start to departmentalize an animation studio. She is the founder of the ink and paint department at Disney, and very specifically thought it was a better way to organize the studio to start departmentalizing
Hmm.
it. Of course, that's a trend that has gone on and on. Um, there's people like Retta Scott, who was the first woman to become an animator at Disney, which was in 1939. Harriet Burns, who was one of the first three ever Imagineers, as they would eventually come to be known, and was very much, one of the great Disney Imagineers. Um, we don't ever hear about them. We don't ever talk about them. And that's one of the things that she looks at is why is it always Mary Blair who sort of leads the forefront in that. Um, and then the next article, which kind of, I'd say kind of attaches slightly to, not attaches, but sort of has in common slightly with the first article. The second article is by Andras Lennart, and it's called Donald Duck Goes South, Walt Disney and the Inter-American Relations. He's looking in that article at Walt Disney's tour of Central and South America in 1941. And of course, when he did this tour, and he was sent there by the Roosevelt administration as a
Hmm.
goodwill ambassador, he brought along a hand-picked group of his artists who during the tour, become known as El Grupo. And Mary Blair, of course, was one of the artists on El Grupo. And in his paper, in Lennart's paper, he talks about, amongst other things, sort of why Walt Disney and Disney artists are sent on this Goodwill Ambassador tour.
Hmm.
Looks a little bit at sort of inter-American relations and how they had, of course, had some really difficult, problematic relations in the late 19th, early 20th century. So this is the Roosevelt administration really working to improve those uh, ties and doing so partly because, it's better to be friends with your nearest countries than to be enemies or have problems with them. But also, even more crucially, again, this is 1941 that this is happening. World War II has
Hmm.
already begun. America is not yet in it. There are worries of sort of fascist sympathizing in Central and South America, and the US is officially neutral, but it's going to go with the Allies, and they don't want fascist leaning countries right on their doorstep. It's an obvious risk in all kinds of ways. And they struggled with other goodwill ambassadors, but with Walt Disney, it is an overwhelming success. And so Lennart is looking at that in his paper and sort of thinking about not only that moment in and of that time period and the sort of geopolitical implications and so forth, but also the artistic implications for Disney, because of course, a number of films come out of that, shorts and two
Hmm.
package features, Saludos Amigos and Three Caballeros, which still sort of hover around the edges of things in Disney, particularly at Epcot in the Mexico Pavilion, where you get the Grand Fiesta Tour and all, which is very Saludos Amigos, Three Caballeros oriented.
Well, and it's really interesting. Both of those articles are extremely interesting, and uh, to me does kind of point toward the who you saw in the opening credits of movies of the features. They were the men working at the company that you saw.
There are a
Um,
few women's names hidden in amongst them,
yeah,
but yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
The second one is really interesting to me because in one of the classes that I've taught many times over the years, it's international relations in sport. And we spend time talking about how countries will use will use these large sporting events like the upcoming Olympic Games to kind of show superiority around the world. And so that I relate what the Roosevelt administration did with sending Disney down to South America in that same way. They were trying to, yes, have good neighbors for and support during World War II. They didn't want, them joining kind of the other side and being influenced by the other side. And it also, at the same time, they were able to use that trip and the products that came from that trip as just additional ways to kind of show the American prowess, if you will, around the
Mhm,
world and kind of the influence of Walt Disney and the American culture. Um,
mhm.
I think Helen, you had the next one or two.
Yeah, I do. The third piece is a video essay by Suresh Kumar Sekar called Disney Screenserts. And in the video essay, Sekar examines how Disney has repurposed its musical films to tap into the more recent trend of holding screenserts, which are film screenings with live musical accompaniment. Of course, he's looking at this as a wholly nostalgic experience that evokes a sentiment both for the film that's being screened and also as part of this silent era exhibition practice. And of course, that's within the context of event cinema. Sekar defines and examines the experiential differences between the variations of film with live orchestra concerts to discuss how Disney has built on its film musical and musical theatre traditions to create a new screen set hybrid. So it's a very interesting video essay, and you get to see lots of different examples of the different definitions and different types, and how Disney has Disneyfied it, for want of a
Mhm.
better word.
Yeah. And then the next article, which is by Bailey Apollonio, called Hidden Histories, Vaulting as Corporate Archival Practice. She looks very much at this idea of the Disney Vault and, talks about how it starts out, which is this, this idea. And I think a lot of people are familiar with this sort of history of that Disney released its films, it re-released them in cinemas sort of every few years, usually around every 7 years or so. It was never quite as hardcore as every 7 years, but roughly. And that this was a way to sort of re-engage with, younger audiences as they came up to, re-engage with people who remembered the film from earlier periods and all that. Sort of coming back to something we were
Mhm.
saying earlier, and worrying about how these films like Soul Luca, Turning Red, that get such a very limited release are going to be remembered. One of the things you have to remember with this old vaulted re-release strategy is that was a way to revive films. And one of the probably the example of that is Fantasia, which everybody is familiar with and remembers very nicely now, but which actually took
Mhm.
26 years to break even on its production costs because it's given such an extremely limited run when it debuts, 12 cinemas in the US, So that vaulting kind of helped with that. But of course, now I think, and this is something that she's certainly arguing, there's a change in that because we don't have this constant sort of re-release strategy. Partly that begins to be eroded by the rise of home entertainment,
Mhm.
VHS, DVD, so forth. But in particular, now that we do have streaming, uh, you know, all the Disney animated features are on there. but not all, of the other sort of live action or hybrid films are on there. Um, but there are some notable and in some cases some notorious exceptions. And the one that she really talks about as a kind of core example of more modern vaulting is Song of the South, which came out, of course, in 1946, directed by Wilfred Jackson. Um, you know, there are copies out there. I myself, I have a recording off of television, off the BBC, from about 15 years or so ago. It's out there, but Disney won't
Hmm.
officially re-release that film probably ever again. I mean, you never say never. They might do a special, very carefully curated collector's edition, but there doesn't seem to be any sign that that's going to happen. They would really love it if everybody forgot this film
Hmm.
existed. And one of the most recent examples of we'd really love it if everybody forgot that is the phasing out of Splash
Yeah.
Mountain as a ride at the Magic Kingdom parks, at least in the US, and replacing this with Tiana's Bayou Adventure. That was quite a controversial decision in some quarters. A lot of weird fetishizing of Splash Mountain to include people selling like 500 ml bottles of
Hmm.
water collected from Splash Mountain for huge sums on eBay and places like that. I mean, personally, I've said it before, I'll say it again in various contexts. My only problem with this ride change is that they've put a bayou themed ride on a mountain, and bayous are notoriously flat and often below sea level, let alone above it. But otherwise, there's probably, and I haven't been on it. I don't know that I will be. I'm not a roller coaster and certainly not a get soaking wet and then walk around Disney World all day kind of person. But my sense is, and from what little pictures and things I've seen, there's been some recycling
Hmm.
of a lot of the audio animatronic, and even those had been recycled from an earlier
Yeah.
thing in the 70s, America Sings. So it's I mean, and it makes sense to get rid of a ride that there is no real film for easily available anymore, that a lot of people won't have seen, and replacing it with a much better known film.
Hmm.
But that in itself is a form of vaulting that Apollonia touches upon in the paper.
I remember seeing Snow White, um, and I saw Song of the South as a re-release,
Mhm,
from the vault in the theaters. I remember those are the two movies I remember
mhm,
seeing on from the vault, like a re-release.
mhm.
And
Yeah,
I do. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, yeah, I remember seeing at least the animated sections of Song of the South
Yeah.
were shown routinely on the Disney Channel, I should say, when it first launched in the early 80s.
Hmm.
So, yeah,
And the kind of the company not wanting it out anymore and permanently putting it in the vault, and maybe that being one of the only things that remains in this like vault, and the vault actually does become just like a sealed off vault, not one that opens.
yeah,
I thought was really interesting. They're wanting people to forget the movie. However, one of their most popular rides used the characters from that movie. I think, and it was also interesting when the announcement to change that ride, which was based on a problematic movie, to Tiana's Bayou Adventure, based on, one of the first, I think, feature length animation, um, that I thought it was very interesting when all of that happened in the summer of 2020, what was going on in society when those decisions or those announcements were made.
yeah.
And so yeah, that's a really, really interesting one
Yeah,
as
and Disney
well.
claimed that the timing of that announcement was merely a coincidence and
Yeah,
that there'd
yeah,
already been things in the works. But it's a very, correlation and causation are not the same thing, but
yeah,
it's interesting. It's interesting timing.
yeah. I think we're on to our third one, our fifth one. Yes.
Fifth, yeah.
Yeah.
Fifth. Yes. Our fifth article is by Toby Hewlin. It's called Stick to the Status Quo. question mark. And Hewlin examines the ways High School Musical, the series, which was produced exclusively for Disney's streaming service for Disney Plus, uses musical nostalgia to expand the popular High School Musical franchise into a new format. So again, dealing with fandom as a way of, I guess, encouraging people to Disney Plus, fans of High School Musical and in this new format with the series. But the article discusses the technological nostalgic dichotomy of the series by underscoring the technological developments of the Disney brand and its increasingly global platform, while maintaining nostalgic and familiar narrative conventions. And we've talked a bit as well how a lot of the articles deal with this kind of sense of nostalgia and how Disney looks to its past, its tradition, its heritage, but also looks to the future, but very much engages with that dichotomy, the nostalgia and the growth and development of the brand. And that's what Hewlin examines by using the High School Musical series as a case study.
Yeah, and a very early success story of Disney Plus.
Mhm.
And I, I would be interested to see how many people. I haven't seen the movies or the series actually, which
I
is
haven't.
interesting because I'm a big fan of musicals, but I haven't seen any of that franchise. I would be interested to know if people actually their first exposure was the series on Disney Plus, and then they returned to see the original movies that were, the Disney Channel original movies. Okay, go ahead. I think.
Well, yeah, the next one is, well, technically the next one is Us.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about
Well,
it.
I'll do it briefly so we can get to the last two because I am going to I want to do a reading of it for people that for of the listeners of the podcast. So look for that in the future. But it was about streaming, and it was called Streaming with the Mouse, and it looks at how Disney as a company used their streaming services or their streaming strategy to engage with consumers. And so it goes through some of the history of it touches on the Disney Vault a little bit, and talks about how Netflix really was a major disruptor in the industry, the reactions studios took to Netflix, where sometimes they're putting their movies on the service at the same time they are trying to develop Hulu, much the same way as studios were when YouTube was new. The marketing departments were trying to put their products on YouTube while the legal departments were suing YouTube. So it's kind of that, like, compete and cooperate. And then leading up to the launch of Disney Plus, through the launch of Disney Plus, and how it has performed so far, and looking into the future of what does consumer entertainment look like, and some of the major factors being live entertainment and live sports entertainment, and the cost of live sports entertainment. Where are those costs going to go? Where are they going to come from, and are customers going to um, are they going to be okay with that? And one note that I will add when I read it as well, but I know Amy and I communicated about so much, is um, even in the final editing process of this article, once it had been accepted, um, we had to add three or four more things. I remember
Mhm.
um, sending something back, or writing something to send back to you, Amy, and then right before I like save the final document is when the announcement that um, Disney was people were now going to be able to access Max through the Disney bundle. And then next was like,
Mhm.
well, by the end of 2024, ESPN Plus is going to be on Disney Plus. And oh, by the way, in 2025, yes, we are doing the ESPN standalone service and all of that. And so it's one of those articles that it was constant change, constant updating. And I'm sure in 3 months we'll go, it will be, as you talked about before, the difference between animation and live action. And live action, you can see when it's created, and then
Yeah.
this will be one of those, that, because it's just ever evolving, but it's a very, very interesting area. So
Well,
if you have anything to add to that, because
yeah.
um, you added, you made the paper 10 times better,
Thank you.
than when it originally started.
Thank you. I mean, it was, I mean, it's such a fascinating topic, I think. And Disney has this long and hugely important history just in the home entertainment industry and how that arises and why that arises. And Disney has shaped so much just by being the one, deciding to back VHS instead of beta, Blu-ray instead of I think it was HD TV or something like that. It's a hugely important player in that market. And it even, it has a precursor streaming service. If you were in the UK
Hmm.
or the Philippines, why those two countries, I honestly don't know. But between 2015 and 2020 here in the UK, we had a streaming service called Disney Life, one word. And it was in some ways similar to Disney Plus. In others, it was a vastly different sort of setup. And I think that was their sort of, I think they chose two small countries, one of which obviously is an English speaking country predominantly, to do this kind of dry run and figure out what do we want, what don't we want. And just like even some of the things you were saying about, Disney Plus and being able to access Max and things like that. Um, that's maybe true in the North American market,
Hmm.
but in certainly in the UK, we don't have Hulu. We don't have, some of the, we don't have Max, a couple of others like that. So, like for instance, here there are a number of Hulu series, as they are in the US and Canada, that here are Disney Plus series. Probably,
Hmm.
the best known example would be Only Murders in the Building. Um, that's how we watch it. And I always feel like we're kind of the lucky ones. We only have to subscribe to Disney Plus
Yeah.
and we get all this other stuff. I've not noticed myself a lot of this sports stuff. Um, it could be because I couldn't care less about sports if you paid me to have a disinterest in it. So maybe I'm just not seeing it. But, because obviously algorithms and things like that for these things matter. But that's more the North American side.
Hmm.
And maybe partly that is a way to, sort of how they're handling it in countries like the UK, to think about, well, we get a lot more subscribers, to include people who don't care much about the Disney side because they want all this other stuff.
Yeah.
So maybe if we bring that in with the North American market, which is obviously a much, much larger market by far, that's a chance to really expand the service there.
Hmm.
But also, sort of thinking about that steady progression, historical progression from let's start engaging with VHS to let's have all these streaming platforms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Streaming doesn't happen out of nowhere.
Yeah.
There is a logical historical progression. And I don't think that's entirely just with hindsight,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was
And
going to
then,
say, Cody, I do remember your abstract came with the caveat that, oh, this will probably be out of date before I've even finished it, and how much time can I have? But I think what's really nice about this collection is that it is a snapshot of
yeah,
Yeah.
Disney at 100 years. So that's where we've got the value of these pieces.
yeah. And if it makes you feel better as
Yeah.
far as suddenly being out of date, I published my second monograph, Handsome Heroes and Vile Villains, and about a month later, Frozen came out.
Yeah. Yeah. This
It
is
was
this.
just like,
Yeah. I think you have the last two, correct, Helen? Go
Yeah.
Yeah,
ahead.
I do. I do. So the next one is by Niall Richardson. It's called Part of Whose World? How the Little Mermaid 2023 attempts to revise the racist tropes of the 1989 animated film musical. So, in this article, Richardson re-examines the representation of race in The Little Mermaid, the animated film, to argue that the film, particularly in its musical sequences, presents an implicitly racist narrative. Through a comparative analysis, Richardson argues that racist tropes in the original film are made even more explicit by the clear revisions made by the 2023 remake. And it's an interesting one because when we've talked about how important the Renaissance period was for Disney animation, and The Little Mermaid, released in 1989, is very much attributed as starting the Renaissance, so one
Hmm.
of Disney's most profitable, successful periods in its history. Um, so this is a really interesting paper that kind of re-examines that with that
Yeah.
lens.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
And then finally, by a foreground in the cultural challenges to Disney's representation in its 100-year history, Priscilla Hobbs and Antares Lesk examine how successful the company has been at responding to these changes. So again, it's something we've already touched on with regards to representation and how Disney's films have reflected societal changes. But this article, titled Diversity in Disney's Theme Parks, Is It Working? Hobbs and Lesk analysed three popular and problematic Disney theme park attractions to understand how Disney functions as a cultural influencer and how these rides have evolved to suit larger cultural shifts. And we've already talked about Splash Mountain, and they engage with that ride as one of their three case studies in the article. And they talk about I guess, the different layers that we've also mentioned with regards particularly to that ride, and how the changes still have the essence, I guess, of, or the footprint of what they were before. So
Hmm.
again, a timely piece given
Yeah.
the timing of the changing of that ride into the Princess and the Frogs.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah, Tiana's Bay Area Adventure.
yeah, and very interesting. I look forward to reading all, well, I guess it's seven. I guess I'll read eight because I am familiar with one. But I'm really interested, especially as I try to learn more and more about this area and more about just the very wide swath of research that is going on within Disney, and I feel I'm very much different from a lot of people who research Disney. Because I'm not really researching Disney content. I'm more researching like the company and the competition and things like that because that's the background that I have. So it's very, very interesting to me to hear about all of these. And so thank you both for joining to talk about this and have other conversation about your fandom, about your research, how you got to where you are. Um, and I know Dr. Haswell, we've held you long past when I originally said we would. So if you need to log off, that's perfectly fine. How would people be able to get in touch with you for follow-up questions or conversation or anything?
I can give you my email address and you can put it in the notes for
Okay.
the episode if that's okay.
Okay, well, perfect. And thank you for joining us. And again, the last thing we close on is rapid questions. Those are quick questions. If you want to stick around, feel free and answer. If not, I completely understand stepping away. So thank you very, very much for your time today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. I'm happy to stick around if you want to do
Oh, okay.
your quick fire questions.
Then we have I have five or six. And I know that we discussed a little bit before the parks related interests. And so I know Helen, you said this may not be more of your area. So um Amy, I will ask you, and Helen, if you want to jump in on any of these, jump in. The last two will definitely be down both of your alley. So favorite park, and that could what I mean is individual park, like individual gate, Magic Kingdom, Disneyland, things like that.
Okay. I mean, and it's kind of hard to say. I think probably Epcot,
Okay.
but I mean, I could never go to Disney World and not go to the Magic Kingdom. And of course, the original one is just it's special, you know.
Yeah. We made our first trip to Disneyland this last summer, and it was just phenomenal. It's
Mm,
amazing, and it is very easy to attend with or to go with families. You're not
mm,
traveling as much as you are around Walt Disney World, either transportation or
mm.
driving. Um,
Yeah.
so then the next question is favorite attraction at any Disney park. It doesn't have to be your favorite park. It could be any Disney attraction you've been on.
I have to give three because
Okay.
they're equally tied. Haunted Mansion, which, goes right back to my very first ever trip. Um, the Wedway People Mover, which I know is
Hmm.
a weird one, but I adore the Wedway People Mover as it used to be known. I forget what it's called, Walt Disney World
Now,
Transit Authority or something like
now it's
that now.
the Tomorrowland Transit Authority
That's
People
it.
Mover.
That's
And
it.
it's one of
The
my
one.
favorite. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a weird one, but it's wonderful. And last but in no way least is the Grand Fiesta Tour, so the Donald Duck Three Caballeros ride in the Mexico Pavilion.
Yeah.
It's corny and it's wonderful and I adore it.
Yeah. It's also when I was a kid, I loved riding inside and riding by the big pyramid. And
Hmm.
then also seeing the restaurant off to the right, kind of like I think it's Blue Bayou in Pirates of the
Yeah.
Caribbean and Disneyland.
Yeah.
I know that had something to do with it as they when they built Pirates of the Caribbean, they built it smaller. So when they built the ride in the Mexico Pavilion, they wanted to include a restaurant because they didn't get
Hmm.
to in Magic Kingdom. Um,
Hmm.
so the last we can combine three and four because it's favorite food, so favorite restaurant, um, and then also favorite snack at any of the Disney parks. And again, Helen, if you want, jump in for any of these if you have
Well, I was
input.
going to say, I mean, I'm a terrible Disney fan because I've only ever been to Disneyland Paris. Um, but I went before it closed down, the Rock and Roller Coaster with
Mhm.
Aerosmith.
Mm.
That was probably my favorite. That and Peter Pan's Flight were my two favorite rides.
If you ever do make it to Walt Disney World, um, that's still in Hollywood Studios for the time being. It's always rumored that it's going to be rethemed as well. Have you because that's in Disney Studios, right? Walt Disney Studios. And that was the one that was rethemed to Iron Man. Correct. Have you been on it since then?
To the yeah, Avengers, but no, I haven't.
Okay. Okay. I wonder what the kind of because when they throw around ideas for the retheming of the one in Hollywood Studios, um, they kind of make references to that at that time. So so then favorite restaurant and favorite snack in any Disney park. That could include Downtown Disney, Disney Springs, Disney Village, anything like that also.
Okay, yeah. I think my favorite restaurant is the San Angel in the one in Mexico at Epcot.
Okay.
Just because, okay, the food is very nice and all that, and but it's the atmosphere of it that you're in this what's sort of meant to be like a nighttime sort of market square in some an unnamed Mexican city. um, the ride, the boats going past from the ride and all that. Had great fun one time a couple of years ago when my family was there, and my nephew and brother went riding by on the boat as we were sitting there
Yeah.
still at our table in the restaurant. In fact, I think they rode the ride 6 times in a row. It's either got a huge queue or zero queue,
Yeah. Yeah.
and never in between. But yeah, it's just It's such a cool place to eat. There are other places that I like to go, but yeah, no favorite food, and I'm not really a snacker.
Okay.
So I can't claim a favorite snack food.
Okay.
I could tell you the ones that repulse me just to see them. But like those awful turkey legs, actually ostrich legs. I don't understand that. I just don't. And that Disney restaurants serve soup. Do you want to eat soup in 100% humidity and
Yeah.
huge and hot in a subtropical environment?
Yeah.
But to
Uh,
each their
well, when we go to Walt Disney World, we try to avoid the summer. So when we're going, it is 80 to 90, not, 95 to 110 or whatever, I guess. So it's uh so the last two, and this both deal with Pixar. The first one is you can explain if you want. You don't have to explain if you don't want. Just give your answer, and we'll take it at that. Your favorite Pixar movie?
For me, it has to be Up.
Okay.
I mean, the opening 10-minute montage that just rips your heart out,
yeah.
that Pixar seem to do so well. Um, yeah, it's got a personal connection for me.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, that film for me every time, beautiful.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I do love, yeah, I've never cried so early in a film in my life, but for me, my favorite Pixar is Wall-E. I
Okay.
just, that film is just, it's so stunning in so many ways. And like the fact that you go so long before you even hear the character talk,
Yeah.
and it's this wonderful sort of, almost sort of silent movie era pantomime. And then that, I always think of it as a ballet in the stars when Eve is flying around
Hmm.
and Wally's got it's sort of fire extinguisher or something that
Yeah.
he's using to sort of jet propel himself around. And it's just a stunningly beautiful moment in cinema. And yeah, Wally.
And you know what's so interesting about both of those movies? They took not, I mean, they took a lot of chances. They took big risks
Hmm.
with starting a movie the first 10 minutes that is just going to make you cry, and then like you're recovering ever since then. And a movie where for a large portion of the beginning of the movie, you don't hear any language, you don't hear any dialogue. Those are big choices. And even in Up, that first 10 minutes, you don't really hear dialogue. Um, and so that's something that doesn't really happen now with movies we're seeing now. Like you get in and there has to be dialogue right away to keep, because it's like we got to keep people's interest, because people are used to seeing things on TikTok and very very quick. We got to, in the first 10 seconds of the first 15 seconds, we got to keep people interested and hooked into this movie. But those two movies, whenever I ask people, and we hold a vote of Pixar movies in my class also, like those are always among the top, and they go far in the our tournament bracket that we have in our class, and a lot of people have mentioned those two movies as being among their very favorite of Pixar, which I think is really really interesting, and also goes to kind of what we talked about, Dr. Haswell, you talked about earlier, that Pixar seemingly took less chances after the acquisition of, or being acquired by Disney. Here and there, they've taken chances. Those were two chances that I think the choices they made. And so I think that's a really, really interesting aspect. So then the last one is favorite Pixar character.
The aliens from Toy Story.
Okay. All right.
Oh.
Hello, strangers from the outside. Ooh. Yeah, I just love them. And I have a 3-year-old daughter now who has suddenly embraced them. I don't know if it's the voice or what, but yeah. Mummy, do the claw. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
I don't know if, and I know Dr. Davis, you said you're not a fan of sport. I don't know if this last year during the NFL season in the United States, Disney did a an alternate broadcast of an NFL game, and it was played in Andy's room, like on a floor mat in Andy's room, and the claw was the like. I don't know if you've watched much American football, but after every play, they have to place the football where the play's going to start. The claw was like the thing that would place the football. So it would pick up the football from where it was, it would move it back into the middle of the field. And then the sky cams, so like the ones that you would get the aerial shots, they were controlled by the aliens. Like a claw would come down and they'd be holding the aliens, and the alien would be holding the camera. It was such a cool, like it was such a neat broadcast. And one of the very few NFL games I watched last year. I watched a lot of that broadcast because it was so fun. Okay, so then Dr. Davis, favorite Pixar character.
Honestly, I'm not much of a favorites person. I've come up with some, but I can't come up with a character.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Top two or three is fine.
Oh Lord. I had a very memorable moment once many years ago where I was trying to hold on to my dog who'd run out of the front door just by her collar and hold on to a not flat but definitely widescreen, very heavy, big television that I was trying to get into the house when she dashed out the front door. And I had this moment where I all I could think of was, my God, I've become Elastigirl. So that's always resonated. Um, Wally and Eve are amazing characters. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Buzz Lightyear when he's drunk in Toy Story, that is amazing. That moment, sort of having tea with Mrs. Nesbit
Yeah.
kind of thing. But yeah, that's as close as I can come. I can't think of I
Yeah.
would never choose.
The thank you both for doing this. Again, for having conversation outside of the special issue, for talking about the special issue. I know Dr. Haswell, we talked about how to get hold of you. Dr. Davis, how could people get hold of you for more conversation?
Um, yeah, same way. I'll give you my work
Okay.
email address.
Well, perfect. And before we leave, if there's anything else either one of you have to say, um, feel free. Um, is there anything else you think we've left out?
Go check out the special issue.
Yeah.
Yes,
Go
yes.
read it.
And there will also be a link to that
Okay.
in the show notes as well. So thank you both very much for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank
Thank you. That
you.
was
Thank you
great.
so much.